So, thanks for your patience. Good afternoon together. We welcome you to the second webinar of our joint work project with Cities Alliance. Can I have the next slide, please? My name is Peter Gotsch, and I'm going to host this seminar and introduce to the topic and introduce the other presentations. The contents that we have is, as you see, the introduction, introduction from our partners in Cities Alliance. We will recall a networking event that we have presented at the World Urban Forum. And we will present two case studies from Latin America and from Africa, from my colleagues Margarita Green and Tybert Lavanson. And we will have a round of questions and discussion. Next slide, please. So the objectives of this seminar is to present 3 research networks, to debate the role of research network in urban development, to debate the question how research can, in the best way and most effectively, address policy, how it can be most useful for policy and finally for society. To debate what is the role of being in a place of a local context and what researchers can play in that sense. And related to the joint project with the Cities Alliance, a specific issue we ground this on is the question of equity, equitable economic development and the role of public goods and services. Next slide, please. The speakers is me, Peter Gotsch from NERUST and the Norwegian Technical University, Keith Mudadi, who is the host from Cities Alliance, Margarita Green from the network Redeus in Latin America, based in Santiago, Tybert Lavanson from University of Lagos, representing the AURI network, and hopefully also our colleague Edmundo Werner and Gilbert Siame and Paula Alfaro Alenson will join. I just want to make you aware of all the different locations and places and cities this webinar connects at the moment, which you can always see here. So I think we can go on because the information is slightly redundant, so we don't want to lose time. As a teaser, as an introduction, this is like the starting point also in relation to equity, services and economic growth. This is what Cities Alliance in their project have discussed in an early workshop when they discussed the topic. So we all know that cities are engines of growth and that people flock to cities, people want to be in cities because of sharing, matching and learning and creating innovation and becoming more prosperous. But if people find themselves in those cities, there is also politics and coalitions and competition and not always support among all the members. And so we find a challenge to promote the equitable and inclusive growth. That's like a starting point in a nutshell, if you like. But of course, we also find ourselves today in a situation where if we don't promote the inclusive growth, we will find increasing segregation, increasing inequality, and increasing challenges that can also lead to serious problems and collapse of the system, basically. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the typical situation between policy and research, just to introduce to this gap between policy and research and the need to mediate this gap, is the politics would say that it is manageable to promote inclusive economic growth to public services. Whereas the researcher would say, we have a trend to inequality, exclusion, and segregation that is highly challenging. And there would be a lot of research done about that, and that would be perceived as a huge research issue and topic. And how can these two talk to each other? Both represent realistic issues and very tangible and very real problems and challenges. But we find those two realities. We find this reality actually also when we look what is going on in academia, what is going on in the practice. And that is to share with you kind of point of departure. And the reality is also that underlines the relevance that a study of UN Habitat has described that 3/4 of the world cities today are more unequal than in 1996, than 15 years ago. So we face a serious trend that we know we need to address, but it's relatively complex to address the challenge of urban divide and inclusion and equitable growth. So what do we know? What can researchers contribute? Having said that, I give the floor now to my colleague from Cities Alliance to introduce the joint working program.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, I think.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar. This webinar is being organized under a project that is being funded by Cities Alliance Joint Work Program on fostering equitable economic growth in cities. I just wanted to provide you with a brief overview of the Joint Work Program before we get started with today's discussion. So the Joint Work Program works globally and locally to identify and facilitate knowledge and concrete interventions that achieve equitable economic growth in cities. The hypothesis behind the Joint Work Program is that equitable access to public goods and services by all citizens and formal and informal businesses is a pathway to equitable economic growth. It is funded and chaired by the UK Department for International Development. Part of what we do under the Joint Work Program is to produce peer-reviewed global knowledge products to inform practitioners and policymakers at the global and national level. We have produced a number of publications that are available on our website. They include, for instance, a publication on managing ecosystem goods to foster equitable economic growth in cities. The publication explores the causal links and pathways between ecosystem goods and services and the promotion of equitable economic growth in cities. We have also produced another publication on gender responsive public services, and this publication studies 6 cities: Sao Paulo, San Francisco, Kingston, New Delhi, Nairobi, and Ouagadougou, examining how local interventions to support gender responsive delivery of public goods and services can contribute to the empowerment and inclusion of marginalized and vulnerable citizens. A recent publication that we have worked on is on pricing of municipal services in the Global South. The publication discusses the literature on municipal pricing schemes and tariff structures in the Global South. Our panelists today, I suppose they will discuss how, from the research networks, would discuss and share reflections on how research and policy making can collaborate to promote equitable urban development. And so with this overview of the Cities Alliance Joint Program on fostering equitable economic growth in cities, I would like to give the floor back to Peter to get us started with today's discussion.
Okay, many thanks for this input, and thanks again for hosting us and being our partner. I think we can continue with the slides. So this is just to illustrate the relevance of public services in the widest sense. You know, you have land, housing, water, energy, transportation, and there you have in the red cycle you have more the kind of governmental services and finance and planning, etc. So it's really all encompassing and overarching, which makes it a challenge, for example, for the researchers to concentrate, and because it is reflecting on a complex reality. You know? Can we have the next slide? The next slide shows simply the SDGs, and when you think about it, then the basic services and public goods is more or less related to all the SDGs, each individually, maybe a few of them stronger and few of them lesser. We can have the next slide. And the next slide is showing you that this particular webinar connects to the networking event that we have been running in the World Urban Forum. We can have the next slide that shows you the situation from there. We have quite a few, we have the members of the 3 networks, and I think we have as an international audience as we have today. And so we are building and expanding and deepening those issues that we have been discussing there. Next slide. So we have the 2 overarching themes, as you might have realized. It's towards impactful research, bridging research and policy. That's one part of the discussion. And the other part is promoting just equitable development through public goods and services. So some of the results from the WUF that have been presented, for example, we will see in one of the upcoming presentation today that the experience from Latin America that was focusing a lot on economic development on very market-oriented development on economic indicators, while maybe the social indicators have been neglected. And today we see many protests, we see a huge divide in society. We see that economic development does not automatically lead to a greater societal prosperity, but it can lead to serious problems and divided society. Another quote was, researchers need to invest time in local governments and vice versa. Local government needs to invest time with local universities. That was like a very practical finding, a very practical recommendation some people made. Okay, research universities and local governments should partner, should seek partnerships, and they should even install offices and chairs and desks in the other institution so that they could be more present. And I'm sure that in a few places we find this practice already exists, but it should be more mainstream and more promoted. The third point, can I read the third point from the last slide, was, that's the illustration, I guess, also of the second, that the local governments need to have open doors. Thank you. So the 3 research networks, now focusing a little bit more on that. What does it mean, NERUS? Network Association of European Researchers on Urbanization in the South. AURI is the African Urban Research Initiative. And the REDEUS LAC is Red de Desarrollo Urbano Sustainable Latinoamérica y el Caribe. Next slide, please. I can talk a bit about especially NERUS, and you will see the slides on the other networks, but Margarita and also Taibat will have an own brief introduction to that. I can only say that the value of a network like NERUS is that it was founded as an independent network to match people from different institutions, mainly universities, to enable a critical position and today it has 500 members. It started with EU funding. That's why the name is European researchers, but this does not imply that the members are all from Europe. That's only how it started. And the main value is also when you go to the website, you will see there is a archive of all the annual conferences. So you find a huge knowledge archive showing you how the debates and discussion and knowledge in the urban field has been 10 years ago, has been 5 years ago, and how it is today. So please visit the website and use it also as a knowledge archive. Next slide. So as mentioned before, I will not explain Auri in more detail. I just want to inform you also that after this webinar, you will be able to download the presentation also and to find more information. But it's a like-minded network from Africa based in Cape Town, but with members in many African countries. And Redeus Lac is a bit similar. It is based in Latin America and Caribbean, and today represented by our colleague Margarita, who is also presenting. So I try to summarize, and this is actually one of the main slides I want to present to you from my part, is that so these networks are independent of institutions, they are voluntary, they are politically non-aligned, they are pro-people and civic society, they are frugal based on initiatives and voluntarism. We have been asked very often why we still around, why we survive. If you think about many networks that are project-based, that receive money, it is often the case that when the project is finished, when the money has been spent after 3 years, for example, this kind of network or platform will close down. But this is not the case in the networks we have. This is the kind of fascinating aspect. We can offer constructive and reflective positions, and the dialogue between research and policy has been a tradition, actually, also the critical dialogue. And it's very much supporting and assisting young researchers, because there is no constraint, there is no membership fee, or there is no big constraint to join the conference. It's very easy to participate and to network. We embrace self-government. The management team is being updated regularly, so there is not one person driving the whole thing for 20 years. There is always a change. I already said we are challenging the kind of mainstream what the World Bank or European Union does in policy can be reflected, and also in this case Cities Alliance. So they are really more networks than projects, and part of some kind of public sphere. So that was the point I wanted to make about the relevance and important to have such kind of networks and the value of it. And just hoping that that also they will have this dynamic now to collaborate in the 3 different regions, which opens up a new dimension. Next slide. So this is an example of what we are doing now in this case with Cities Alliance, just in one of the working packages. So we are reviewing the knowledge and reports and try to verify the state of research. We are organizing webinars, and we are, for example, composing reflection papers. Other working packages are doing complementary work. Next slide. Next slide, yes. And this is the example of some of the deliverables. One of those is the webinar And there will be additional webinars coming in the future. Next slide, please. So some of the also findings or observations, summaries from the World Urban Forum that are very relevant for today's webinar is that some points how we could define action-oriented recommendations towards sustainable urban development. So what are the points we can address and contribute? So one is to promote decentralization. One is to promote action-oriented research, to promote research that is close to society, that tries to make a direct impact. A very pragmatic one is to encourage researchers to produce easy-to-read reports. We know as academics how easily we end up also in our bubbles and talking only to ourselves. To encourage researchers to come up with clear normative content. Normative means in terms of policy recommendations, in terms to not only do descriptive research, but to recommend what should be done, to encourage academia to measure impact of research on the basis of societal and policy impact. That means we should measure the value of what we do, not only on the basis of numbers of scientific papers, but combined with policy impact or societal impact. To facilitate communities of practice and learning between researchers, government officials, we remember, to promote universities as a public domain, and to also to communicate to the politicians that we need, and policymakers, that we need to acknowledge urbanization as a in its full complexity, that needs to lead to beyond silo thinking and integrated solutions. That is not new, but that is still a task that is out there. And the last point is also coming back into this list, that universities need to partner more with cities and vice versa. So we can continue. The next slide, please. This is one of my last slides, and this is for the visitors and the people who are listening and who hopefully ask questions about the presentations. So which stories of success and failure do you know about inclusive urban development, inclusive economic growth, and the role of public goods and services? What type of cities and policies do we need? What role can research play in informing policy? And what if growth benefits all when markets continue to produce inequalities? So this is a bit an outline, and we'll be happy to hear comments and questions from you. Having said that, I will introduce the first input from Margarita Green from Santiago de Chile. I welcome you to the floor, Margarita, and you will also address some of the questions that I just raised. Thank you.
Hello. Hello, here I am. I hope you're listening to me. Am I being listened? Everything all right?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. Right, well, I am Margarita Green. I am the coordinator of this network that Peter was talking about, which is Redeus LAC. It's a network of on urban development, on sustainable urban development for Latin America and the Caribbean. So what I brought you today, I intend to manage, I was going to switch to my, so this is a network. I was going to switch to my own desktop, but right, I think you're doing it for me, aren't you, Colin? Now, there it is. So this is my right. So here you are. Can you see my network now? My desktop then? Right, well, this is my network here. And what I'm going to present today is equitable economic growth through provision of public goods and collectives, especially talking about the provision of collective space and how we can aim at social cohesion with that. So first of all, I started with this image, which I find very good to understand the differences around the world. It's an image where the colors of the dots are signaling how much of the urbanization process is undergoing in that country. So red means advanced, and the colder colors, green especially, and blue are where the sustainable development is slower. So here you have, oh, sorry. I don't think you can see the top of my, sorry. I don't think you can see the top of my, are you seeing my, there. Can you see the top of my slideshow? I don't know, I can't hear you. Well, anyway. I want to get rid of this. Here, right, there you are. So Latin American, so what I was explaining to you was that, backwards, can you go backwards? No, I want to go backwards. Right, can I do it myself there? That's my presentation. So this is what I was saying about the differences of the different countries and how in this context, the difference, for example, between Africa and South America, which is a very urbanized country, you can see the sort of warm colors that you have in Latin America. So going straight to Latin America, this is our continent, Latin America and the Caribbean. And this is how it looks with that symbols that I was showing to you. So the three big countries are Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, with, Brazil with over 100 million people and very urbanized. And then there are others like Colombia, Ecuador that are coming afterwards. And there are some in the Caribbean that are less urbanized. How did this all happen in Latin America? So this is how it happened. This is a very short summary of this process that we've lived in Latin America. It is an extremely rapid urbanization process. It was through much informality with little urban planning, and it produced strong urban inequality and a big social spatial segregation. On the other hand, we have strong community and family ties, which we're very proud of. We have rich local cultures, and we also have some quite clever solutions with scarce resources, which we would like to share some of them today. Also, trying to summarize the situation in Latin America, we have quite unstable political systems. And in fact, I come from Chile, and during the last year, we have had what we called a social unrest, very, very strong, and which is quite surprising if you think of the socioeconomic indicators that Chile has had. For example, in the last years, poverty diminished from 48% to less than 10%. Unemployment was approximately 8%. But there was such a strong inequality and physical and social segregation that last October, we had 1.2 million people marching, protesting, and demanding a new social pact. This is a picture of how the city looked with all these people in the streets, which were there with children, with families. So I just wanted to sort of stress the point that Peter was saying, that it became very clear that only managing the economic indicators wasn't enough, right? So let's go to two programs that I wanted to show you, which I think are an example of this sort of, I don't know the word now in English, but it's, when you have scarce resources and you can have a big impact without spending a lot of resources. So those two programs are, one, the neighborhood upgrading program, and second, the open street program. The neighborhood upgrading program, many of you might know it, but it has a long tradition in Latin America. So it started when Latin America, with this rapid urbanization process, was done a lot of it through the building of slums by the people. So what happened after that was, well, here, sorry, I missed this slide. It's because I was just showing all the ways that these slums have been named around the world, but they're all in the end the the same thing. They are the construction of informal settlements and dwellings that do not have all the proper, that do not satisfy all the needs for the people that are dwelling on them. So what did we do? We used neighborhood upgrading programs. This program you can see on the left, a slum, and how this sort of program would provide not only the pavement that you can see, but also the drainage, drinking water, electricity, lighting on the streets. But at the same time, and this was, you know, they started in the 70s, 80s in Latin America, and they're still going in some of our countries. But then on the other hand, at the same time that we were doing that, because of this rapid urbanization process, we had to produce massive housing programs that produced many houses. So after many houses, but not the social equipment that the houses need for them to be sustainable. So in the end, we had this sort of thing. We had vast amounts of urban settlements that did not have the proper parks, social equipment, urban equipments. So what are we doing now? What we call the neighborhood upgrading programs .2, which are providing collective space, right, for these either dwellings that started as slums and were upgraded, or these massive programs that did not produce, that did not give all the urban amenities needed for having a proper urban life in them. So what do they do? Many of them, this is, for example, one that was done in Colombia, which it addresses social urbanism. It was done in Medellin. It has been very widely publicized, but one of the things that it stressed was the connection to the city. So not only it provided this sort of I don't know how you call it, telesféricos in Spanish, or electric stairs even in the high rise of the hills, but it also provided very nice buildings with the social equipment, like libraries. And by doing so, it incentivized all the, you know, like this slide that I am putting here, it's showing like it's not informal because it's formal, but it is done from the local people that create their own commerce to attend to the necessities of the people. So in Chile, we have one of these programs, and it's called Quiero Mi Barrio. And I just wanted to point that it goes to 4 principles: integral, participative, it addresses multiple scales, and it addresses sustainability. And on the other hand, it works on 3 axes, which are identity and heritage, environment and safety. So it approaches every program, what we would say cross-cuttingly, so through the 3 axes and addressing the 4 principles. And I just wanted a very short presentation of this program, of the part that I consider sort of special. For example, in its diagnosis, that the first thing it does in its first phase, it does a diagnosis of the settlements that usually lacks a lot of these social amenities, and it elaborates a neighborhood contract. How does it do that? It addresses not only the physical aspects, you know, like urban equipment, green areas, housing, land use and property, but also it approaches things like participation, identity, heritage, security, environment, and connectivity. And then what they do is they do a construction management plan together with a social management plan. Many times the social management plan involves, for example, activities, art things, and in the end, the local government, together with the central government and the organized community, they make a neighborhood contract and they say, this is the plan we're going to do in the next 3 to 5 years. So the second phase is the execution of that neighborhood contract. And the third phase is the evaluation and the closure of the program. Through this program, what we have, well, I just wanted to show that the data that I am showing has to do with 12 settlements that we saw in different cities of the country. And this is the sort of thing that they provide. The colored things are equipment that the program did to the built on the settlements. For example, pedestrian precincts, community center, miradors, communities, plazas and courts, right? So what are the final considerations, or what happened with all this, implementation of this program? Yes, we did create social cohesion, and yes, we improved identity and attachment to the neighborhood, But nevertheless, we have to say that there were some paradoxical relations. For example, it improves the quality of social ties. Nevertheless, when the program abandons the settlement, many times that tends to diminish. Second, the satisfaction of and the pride of living in the neighborhood increases. Nevertheless, the relationships of trust and neighborhood support do not always improve with it. And third, and that is quite interesting, is that the interventions are very well used and they're very well maintained by the people, by the proper neighborhoods. Nevertheless, the care and maintenance of the streets and the squares, which were not intervened by the program, are not good. Like the good, let's say, idea of taking care of the space doesn't follow for the whole settlement. It only addresses the projects that were done through the program. That was the first one. But the important thing of this one that I was showing to you is that how it developed from being at the beginning in the 60s or 70s, only improving the drainage and the lightning and the building of roads. Nowadays, it is going to heritage, identity, social cohesion. But that it is doing it not only through social programs, but also by creating collective space that can be open plazas or can be community centers, for example. And the other one, I will go shorter. I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but I wanted to show the Open Street program. This is a program that was created in Colombia, and what it addresses, it closes roads, like in this slide here on the top. It shows that this is a road during the week, and during the weekend on Sundays, it closes half of it, and it gives it to the, bicycle commerce and people just sort of going there to have a look at the city. It has gone all through Latin America. Here you see all the programs, and we have some in Chile also. And last year we did some research with our students, and we wanted to see how the impact of this program had affected the perception of the landscape and the city, social cohesion, urban vitality, physical activity, and health perception. So what we did is I sent lots of students and they stopped them. They gave them bananas so that they would stop to participate in the interview that we made. And they marked where they were coming, what they did, how long they used it. And from all the data, it was very interesting. So you see, these are all the places in Santiago de Chile. The black lines are these that are open for people on Sundays. And these are all the people that we interviewed, where they were coming from. These were the place where they were coming from. So it was interesting to see that it goes quite far away. Like you can see these dots, they're coming from quite far away. And what we saw that, for example, city perception, 88% of the people declared that their perception of the city had changed, thus creating, let's say, better citizens. And also we saw that 63% meets friends. We saw a lot of these, like young people would connect through the social media and would meet downtown to do skateboards, for example, which was thought was very interesting. So the final considerations that we drew about this program is that with that it has very good effects on the urban life, on health, on social cohesion, and on placemaking. In social cohesion, people come from different local authorities to meet. Placemaking, people know and appreciate the city. Thank you very much. I think I'm a bit out of time.
Many thanks, Margarita. So this was Margarita Green, Professor and Director of the Center for Sustainable Urban Development in Santiago de Chile. Sorry for the challenges with the screen. We will follow with a second presentation of Talbot Labanson, my colleague from AURI, who is co-director of the Center for Housing Sustainable Development in Lagos. So I'm calling you to the floor with the second presentation, and thanks again for joining. Maybe I ask the organizers to open up the possibilities for the questions, so we can already have a list of questions before we conclude. Thank you.
Hello, everybody, and Thank you for having me. I'll be speaking on the research policy engagements on the Lagos Resilience Journey. About 12 days ago, the Lagos Resilience Strategy was launched with the support of the 100 Resilient Cities Network. My center, the Center for Housing and Sustainable Development at the University of Lagos, provided technical support for that project, and I'll be speaking about that. But first, let me tell you a bit about the African Urban Research Network. Next slide, please. So we are an interdisciplinary research network of about 15 members across 20 members across 15 African countries, dedicated to producing credible knowledge on the drivers of urban crisis and really casting a lens from a grounded context. We are also, one of our major objectives is also to improve the dissemination of new and existing research from African researchers, particularly those that are locally generated but often poorly accessed. And the website is as seen on the screen. Next slide, please. Some of the work we've done in the immediate past has been to convene a couple of workshops across our different cities. We have done the formal informal network, formal informal interface workshops in Cairo, in Zambia, and in Dar es Salaam over the past year. Next slide, please. And our work currently is to expand membership and global reach, to submit edited volumes as part of the Routledge Cities and Development Series, as part of our assignment of expanding access to credible work from African researchers, as well as nurturing partnerships with other networks in the Global South and other networks that are committed to working in the Global South. Next slide, please. So now I take you to Lagos. So this is our city. Lagos is a city of complexities. It's about 26 million population in a very fragile ecosystem where very vulnerable to coastal erosion. But in spite of that, there's a lot of activity. Our city is one of intense growth. It's also a city of intense inequality. And so we have, next slide, please. We have a lot of individual resilience. Next slide, please. We have a lot of individual resilience, and the main aim of the resilience strategy was to transit from individual resilience to institutional citywide resilience. And so in 2006, Lagos was admitted into the 100 Resilient Cities Network. Finally, in 2018, a resilience office was established. And sometime in June 2019, a preliminary resilience assessment was published. And this was based on a stakeholder engagement with all identified networks across the city, from local communities to people living with disabilities to traditional leaders, business sector, the academic community, the legislature, NGOs, and so on and so forth. Like I said earlier, about 2 weeks ago, the Lagos Resilience Strategy was finally launched. From the next slide, from the resilience assessment, shocks and stresses were identified, and these include the following. Next slide, please. Okay, leading to the preliminary assessment work, a couple of workshops were done, and most of the data was developed from the ground up. It was sourced from the stakeholders that I had mentioned earlier, using different methodologies, including the agenda setting workshop, where people, residents of the state, were able to identify their priorities, focus group discussion with different stakeholder groups, study tours of industries and solution providers and those who had interventions across identified areas, And then there was a Resilience Lagos Network, Lagos Week, which had people, discussing the major issues, particularly issues of poverty, issues of access to water, and issues of using technology to, because we are meant to be a smart city, issues of using technology to galvanize the urbanization process. Eventually, shocks and stresses were identified, and the shocks include economic downturn, disease outbreaks, building collapse, urban fires, and forced evictions, while the stresses include formal, informal economic contestations, traffic congestion, overpopulation, inadequate health systems, and erratic power supplies. These were further coalesced into 5 discovery areas. The discovery areas formed the, and this was where the center came in. The 5 discovery areas are urban informality, energy poverty, the knowledge economy, the gigacity addressing issues of overpopulation and population growth, as well as the water city addressing issues of the flooding vulnerability that the city is prone to, as well as issues of accessing clean potable water as given in SDG 6. Next slide. And so, we had to organize these discovery area workshops. We invited stakeholders from across various groups, and then they looked at it and they were able to identify about 50 interventions with which those issues in those discovery areas would be addressed by the city. After a 3-day workshop where these were further streamlined, we had the opportunity assessment workshop where these initiatives were put to the test: the resilience test, the practicability test, and the culturally sensitive test, to make sure that when those interventions or initiatives, as they are called, are finally implemented, they will stand the test of time. They will be able to change the narrative with regards to whatever solution that they were providing, and most importantly, that there will be a good uptake by the citizens. After that, we had the visioning workshop, the strategy writing workshop, and a series of strategy validation meetings. What makes this very important is the fact that the Lagos Resilience Strategy was built on partnership, with the 100 Resilience City providing an overarching framework and the global network support, the University of Lagos Center for Housing providing the technical support and local grounded research capacity, as well as bridging the gap between the people and the government due to the distrust and some of the friction that we have in a city as large as ours. And then the Resilient Lagos office is responsible for the development, implementation, and institutionalization of resilience in Lagos. Next slide, please. So the working of that strategy was one that was based on a global agreement, looking at the SDGs and trying to domesticate the SDGs in Lagos development agenda, and looking at all the issues and interventions through the resilience lens in order to ensure sustainability, and finally grounding it in the state's priorities, so that at the end of the day, the city is able to thrive, the city is stronger for it. Next slide. So the resilience strategy is based on 3 pillars, 10 objectives, and 31 interventions called initiatives, and they address the 3 dimensions of sustainability. We have the efficient city with response to physical development. We have the enterprise city, which responds to economic development, and we have the inclusive city, which responds to social development. And the initiatives cover a wide range of activities, from education, preparing the youth for the fourth industrial revolution, creating an effective database for Lagosians, creating an e-health system to allow for monitoring and tracking and disease surveillance, to increasing the capacity of communities to deal with flood, provide water, provide energy, as well as ensuring that the informal economy that is thriving but essentially community-led can be improved by supporting the development of the computer village and the Nollywood film industry. So we had initiatives developed across these various areas. And then the vision of the strategy is to be an innovative, inclusive, and prosperous city, leveraging the appropriate governance and infrastructure mechanisms to empower the people to thrive, adapt, and grow into a more resilient city. Next slide, please. So as a direct takeaway, at the launch of the strategy, we had feedback from those who had been part of the process and somebody who was introduced to the strategy at the very last minute. And so the managing director of the Global Resilient Cities Framework highlighted the fact that the strategy had real cross-sectoral ownership, while the Vice Chancellor of the Lagos State University, who reviewed the completed strategy, articulated that it is a complete shift from fragmentation and incoherence to a linking of the most specific items of short-term change with an overall longer-term vision. And we're indeed gratified by this because that was our objective at the beginning of the day, that let us have a strategy that addresses the small issues while also, having a carry-on effect to being part of the bigger picture. Next slide. And there were many lessons for us as academics engaging on this policy framing journey. We realized that there's no need reinventing the wheel, and sometimes the blue sky thinking of the academy really needs to come down and look at what people are doing already, what the government is doing already. Oftentimes, all it needs is some tweaking, some modification. And that it's also important, particularly now that there are scarce resources, to look out for initiatives that solve more than one challenge. And most importantly for us was the understanding that resilience, even though it is a scientific concept, as it were, is a deeply political process. And then it is important to win on the political sphere if we're going to be able to achieve the other things we set off to do. And so a lot of negotiations, a lot of patience went into that process. But at the end of the day, the gospel we preach is that people matter. I think whatever we do as researchers and as policymakers, particularly in those engagements, we must remember and we must always highlight that we're doing it for the people and that people indeed matter. And finally, it's also important to think outside the box. A lot of the opportunities that are available now are actually shrouded as problems. And so in thinking about how to solve the problems, of our communities and our cities, we should always look out for the opportunities within the problems. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Yes, many thanks, Talbot. We almost reach our time, but I suggest we take 10 more minutes. Of course, whoever needs to leave, needs to leave. So I want to invite briefly for one statement my colleague Edmundo Werner, who works for the International Labour Organization, that is very closely related the work to the topic of economic development, of jobs, of employment, etc. And I will try to address some of the questions after this statement. Edmundo, are you there?
Hello, yes, I'm here.
Great.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, sure.
I can hear you partially. Can I make some comments?
Yes,
based on what was presented and the notes that I made?
Try to be concise and keep it short in 3 minutes.
Okay, so I will do my best. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
We can.
Yeah, okay. So thanks again for the opportunity to take part in this forum and also in the webinar. I picked up some selected points. I'll try to connect them through a thread of issues and questions, starting with the overall approach, equity, services, and economic development in cities in the global south. It is an important relation of topics. The ILO, where I work, heavily supports equity and economic development for the sake of social justice and poverty alleviation. I also fully acknowledge the importance of urban services to achieve both growth and equity. Actually, is very difficult to do it without services. Now, it is of course very important to keep investigating, such as why urban services are not properly provided, or even when they are, or even why they are vandalized in some cases. There are of course good examples of equitable provision of urban services, so it's important to ask questions to understand the reasons of success and failure and the potential for replicability in other contexts. Still related to the urban services, I want to make a link with a point made by Peter at the forum, which may be the core of what I'm going to present. It's about a growth paradigm versus a stabilization paradigm. He said it may not be necessary to grow endlessly, and we should aim for stabilization. I agree in general. The question, of course, is how to address the billions who still live in poverty. And it is difficult for me to suggest a recipe for the whole planet, but we can make some conjectures. One is to implement a stabilization paradigm and at the same time combat poverty. We should be conscious that it will need the redistribution of resources and assets from the wealthy to the poor. Technically speaking, there may be enough resources and assets in most cities and towns which could be redistributed, but the issue is that this means that the wealthy would have to let go part of their surplus in some way. So the question is how to go about it. One alternative is to have targeted growth where it is more necessary to combat poverty, but again, the whole system is not in such a direction, so the same type of question applies. The whole fight for the environment may help a lot in this regard because it already entails, at least in principle, limitations to growth. Of course, a great deal still needs to be done because of the counter insurgents or the resistance to environmental protection, and also what we call greenwash, disguise growth with environmental makeup, but at least a lot of ground has been paved. Also, there is a potential in the social solidarity economy, and which is worth exploring. The issue of secondary cities that was mentioned by the Cities Alliance, they are an important alternative between rural settlement and mega cities, and a good candidate to concentrate targeted and limited growth or redistribution. There is evidence that the well-equipped secondary cities can be very viable solution for those wishing an urban way of living and avoid migration to mega cities. So the event also included the two case presentations. I won't have time to talk deeply about them. It would be interesting to learn more about the causes of success and failure and potential for replication. It's interesting given the focus on research and policy nexus. It's nice and noteworthy to see the case of Lagos. The research team took initiative roles innovative roles beyond academic investigation, acting as moderators or facilitators. I would like to know if there are further examples, and I will conclude with some suggestions on the research policy nexus. In general, a first suggestion already taken on board by in some cases is that researchers should take a more proactive role to influence policymakers. Many times research reports do not trickle down into policy and practice, so easily digestible media material would help, such as videos and leaflets, but also reaching out to policymakers and making a case. The second suggestion already mentioned is action research, and the third and final one is that researchers should spend some time within the objects of investigation, like local authorities or low-income neighborhoods. I mean, not observing what is happening, but acting as part of the team or group and learning from it. We could call it participant action, as opposed to the method of participant observation used in anthropology. The other commentator, Gilbert, I don't know if he's next, he mentioned in the event in the forum that there is such a scheme in his country. This is a good case to be disseminated and hopefully replicated. So if Gilbert is the next one, I conclude with a connection to him. If not, over to Peter. Thank you.
Many thanks, Edmundo, for this contribution. Due to the given advance of the time, I prefer to just to look at the questions that we have. I hope we can address at least one of the questions, and I want to announce that we will try to answer all of them and share with you in the follow-up of this webinar. So there is a question that came first from Josh. Hopefully everybody can also see that. The concept of neighborhood contract is very interesting. To what extent do you think, Margarita, it is challenging for urban aid projects to have long-lasting impacts on the neighborhood contract? And a related question to that was, who is usually involved in organizing community? Margarita?
Sorry, yes, here I am.
Yes.
There. Here I am. No, sorry, I think there's something wrong with that question, because the neighborhood contract doesn't have an impact on the I mean, it's not the contract will have the impact, it's the whatever they do. Usually the neighborhood contract involves projects like making a plaza or making a gymnasium, and also programs, which can be training programs, participation system, you know, like, or activities, like, for example, they decide to celebrate every year, whatever, or to write a book on the story of the settlement. So it's not the contract that has the impact. It is the activities that are agreed in that contract, activities and projects, which later are implemented by the program. I don't know if I made myself clear, if this satisfies your question.
Okay, so thanks for the time being. I see the question was to me, if these networks are non-political, how is it really the right thing? That's how I can understand the questions. Of course, it's a really good one. Of course, those networks and individual researchers, they need sometime, or they need often to find a responsible political position to take a side. But nevertheless, they should remain objective and non-aligned and open if there is a new problem and a new situation and a new challenge to find their respective position based on the research. So, but having said that, there is one last question also to Taibat about the gender focus in this report, in this study, I guess.
Yes, indeed, there was a gender focus. We ensured that at least 30 to 40% of all participants across all workshops were women. We also looked at issues that were particularly directed at women, but at the end of the day, it was discovered that it was more important to have those issues that affected more people. So for example, with regards to the e-health and the databases, you know, we focused on people living with disabilities, but in there we recommended that women issues and then the need for disaggregated data collection was highlighted in there. And also with regards to the issues of water, accessing water, because women are more negatively impacted, that was highlighted. And then in developing the problem statement, we're able to highlight the fact that issues of girls having to leave school and all of that, there needed to be an intervention if we're going to keep the girls in school and meet, you know, the SDG, the relevant SDG for education. So each of those initiatives were tied to one SDG or the other. The issue of market upgrades also affected women directly. So while we did not have any standalone initiatives that addressed women, the gender consideration was taken for most of the initiatives, particularly the ones that were community-based.
Thanks a lot. So I think that was very productive in the last hour. Also, it started getting dark here in Norway. I'm very much also, as I mentioned, amazed by this multi-locality. We should make a mapping of all the presenters and the members in this webinar. There will be several, I think 3 more webinars at least coming from this collaboration between the Research Network and Cities Alliance. You will be able to see the results of this webinar and the announcement of the other webinars under this Habitat Unit website that you can now see. So please read your emails. We will send out also more invitations. Leave us your contacts and join again. I hope that from webinar to webinar we will be more experienced, and we will personally, I hope, be even more use of this to have an interactive discussion by researchers, by colleagues, by partners from very different places and very different locations, so we can have this kind of dialogue, which I find quite a new experience and quite fascinating. So thanks all again to Margarita, to Taibat, to Edmundo, and to Keith, and of course to Colin, who facilitated, and for Paula and her team in Berlin to make this possible in the first case. So thank you so much, and hopefully see you soon. Bye-bye.